I'm really excited this evening to welcome Ilse Ocklers, who's going to be talking to us about Co-videre, seeing together a spiritual activism for these difficult times. Ilse and I were talking some time back around COVID, the way that the world is, and how we are coping with this ourselves. What are our practices? What are our meditations? What are the things that we were doing? And Ilse shared with me the 6 C's, which she's going to be sharing with us tonight. And I've found that this was really compelling and what I wanted to share with the audience and with our Moyo people and community. So the format that we're going to have this evening is, it's a masterclass, but it's also a conversation. Ilse is going to be sharing her information with us. I'm going to be asking some questions as they come up, and we'd ask you to keep your questions for the end. The masterclass is going to be just over an hour, and then we'll take questions after that. So welcome everyone, and most importantly, welcome Ilse.
Thank you, Cindy. I don't know if the most importantly resonates, but it certainly is a privilege. It's really a privilege to be here this evening, and I feel very chuffed that our conversation, which was and always are rich and meaningful conversations, struck a chord with you. And so I'm very excited to be here this evening, and I'm very excited to share some of just my own sense making around these times, and have a real intention that maybe somewhere in there is one thing that is helpful and meaningful to our participants, our virtual participants. We were talking about how much we would have loved for this to have been an in-person workshop, but of course that means that many people wouldn't be able to join us. And so we have to be grateful for technology. So yeah, it's wonderful to be here.
Lovely. Thank you, Ilse. And if you would like to just take us into a meditation and start the evening.
Thanks. So some of you who are loyal sort of Moyo Talks participants might recall Makgati, my friend Makgati Mokoena, and I sharing a series of race conversations on this platform, and we sort of set a ritual for ourselves to start each conversation with a blessing. And so I wanted to honor that and to just start this evening with a blessing, if that's okay. Cindy, that's good? Yeah. So we ask for a blessing on our conversation this evening, and invoking right from the word go the 6 principles or aspects that I'd like to share this evening. In the blessing, we want to ask as follows. Where there is anxiety and overwhelm, may we experience containment within ourselves. Where there is suffering and grief, may there be consolation. May the good, positive actions in the world be strengthened and consolidate. For decisions, large and small, may there be wise counsel. May we have the grace to surrender and embrace the complexity of this world and the times we find ourselves in. And lastly, may we have the inspiration to be able to truly imagine and invoke a just and thriving world. Let it be so.
That is beautiful. Thank you so much, Ilse. And I'm really curious about, we talked about the Co-videres, and why this ritual or this way of being has been significant to you in these troubled times. I mean, today we were just talking and saying that so much can happen in a few weeks, and how we can go through something, a trauma, where we would have a year to process it, and yet we are going up and down in these traumas at this time, whether it be death of somebody we knew, or a situation of a loss of a job, and all these difficult things and these challenges that we're being faced with. Why is Co-videre so significant to you, and why is this practice, why do you want to do this?
So let me start by just sort of casting my mind back to the beginning of lockdown, and maybe those of you who are sharing this time with us can also just cast your minds back to sort of February, March last year, and the kind of shock and denial that we were all in, confronting this absolutely unprecedented event of this global lockdown. And what I remember of the early days is a really what I can only describe as a hot mess of conflicting emotions and sort of paradoxical experiences. I remember sort of as an introvert, the absolute joy and relief of lockdown, of the initial stages of lockdown, and also somebody who used to travel a lot, and just the peace, the exhaling of it. And then in the next moment, one would think of people who were not in the safety of a home with all your basic needs met. And you would immediately have that kind of, conflicting sense of emotions come up. For me, it was a very heightened time of spiritual reflection, but at the same time, I couldn't help feeling guilty about the fact that I wasn't busy somewhere making sandwiches and chopping vegetables and being useful in some kind of practical way. I wanted to be a loyal citizen. I wanted to listen to our president and trust them and give them the benefit of the doubt. But I also wanted to remain a critical, engaged citizen that, had a healthy dose of skepticism about the kind of medical model and, narratives, just certain kind of narratives we were being, that was dominant in the media and so on. I was very soon, we were initially just in that kind of almost held in that kind of embrace of lockdown. And then very soon what began to be revealed to us was that we were not just dealing with the COVID scenario, but we were now dealing with all these other interlocking pandemics. It became revealed to us the extent to which gender-based violence increased in the homes during this time. By May, we had the George Floyd experience, which revealed, the kind of racism, systemic racism in the world. COVID had already revealed to us the incredible inequalities in our own society, in our own community, in our own city. And then, of course, the climate conversation was part of all of this, because there was a very strong sense that the actual origin of COVID had to do with encroachment on habitat, on natural habitats, and that there was a very clear link between climate and what we were experiencing with COVID. And so this became quite overwhelming because of all these interlocking and trans-contextual issues that we were dealing with. And then the last thing that I thought I'd share is just this being so torn between, on the one hand, wanting these old systems to die and to pass away, and being astounded at what happened with, for example, the stopping of air travel, and what happened to sound and nature and all of those kind of nostalgic reminiscences that we now have of the early lockdown period, where people could literally hear the earth's, the heart of the earth beating. For the first time, people could actually listen deeply into the earth itself, because the sound levels had dropped so much. But at the same time, of course, it is such a loss on so many levels, the world as we knew it. And that was so painful in so many ways. So yeah, I'm hoping that as I'm talking, you guys can connect with how for your own selves, what a conflicting time this was, and seemingly so with such chaotic emotions and such contradictory emotions. And so it was, I personally for myself needed to find a way to find my own sense of coherence, find my own equilibrium and my own center back amidst all of this. And then I read somewhere a Facebook post, and it was just in passing. And somebody said, Co-videre, COVID, co-videre. And the Latin for videre means to see, and co means together. And so one way of reframing this very loaded term, COVID, was to think of it as a time of seeing together, co-videre, COVID, co-videre, a time of seeing together. And that was the kind of little golden thread that I sort of took hold of, and that I started kind of pulling towards myself. What did this mean, this notion of seeing together? What did this mean?
And I think, Ilse, I think at that time, I mean, for me, it was also new. It was like, what is going to happen? And the uncertainty within me, and then within how I respond to everything around me. I think at that time I felt quite fragmented. I know that with one of the ways that supported me at the time was that we actually had the platform, and we were doing lots of things, and we were doing meditations, and we were doing podcasts, and that was our way of coping in this new world, because we were creating, but not everyone had that for themselves. And I think a lot of people needed to go deeply inside and work out, you know, different ways of dealing with, it was almost the fragmentedness of the world, wasn't it? It was like the world as we knew it had broken down. And I remember when we were talking, we spoke about how one could weave some form of connectivity, connecting us together. And this is where your process really struck me as something that one could do in order to start bringing that together, to also to be witness to the world and yourself. And, you know, so there's this reflection. And then, I mean, the gurus were talking about this transcendence and kind of how did we fit into that as well? So I think it all comes back to ourselves. And do you want to talk a little bit about that weaving of bringing it together for us?
Yes, I'd love to say something about that, because it is this term of co-videre, this term of seeing things together. And for me, as I started meditating on this, it was as if I was excavating different levels of meditating on this term of seeing together. Because initially there was a lot of seeing, there was a lot of social media, and there was a lot of posting, and there was a lot of scary images. And then there was like hopeful images. And I'm sure many of us can recall, you know, in the early days under lockdown, sort of some of those communities in Italy with the old people standing on the balconies and singing to each other. And there were a lot of images. but so that was the one level of seeing. We were seeing, and as you said, using the term witness, bearing witness to what was happening. But there's another level of seeing, which is what was being revealed to us. And one of the things that were being revealed to us is our interconnectedness, is the fact that boundaries are artificial things. That was one of the things that the virus brought home to us, is this is one world. And the air that we breathe is one air. And the grief that we feel is shared. And the social distancing that we have to practice is for one another. So that was another level of seeing. And then if we think about the term together, you're quite right. For many people with access to Wi-Fi and with, a degree of privilege, the world opened up to some degree. There was a lot of sharing. There were a lot of courses and a lot of support that became available online. And so there was a sense of togetherness that ironically emerged out of this process, even though a lot of it was, was obviously virtual. But it wasn't just the being with other people on Zoom screens. There was also the seeing together that had to do with the revelations and the insights that we were experiencing as a community, as a community, as a city, or as a country, or as a world community. And I'm thinking again of the George Floyd incident and how we learned something about our world together as we saw something together, the seeing together. But the last aspect of the seeing together, I think, is what you were referring to when you spoke about the sense of fragmentation and what you were yearning for around a kind of a reweaving. And that is, if we want to take a last sort of interpretation of this term seeing together, and we want to use if we want to interpret it to say, use your seeing to see, to put things back together again through your seeing, through your witnessing, through making the connections that might have been hidden for you before this experience, this very profound experience that we have all been through together, not similarly, because we are situated very differently, but we have all been through the experience together. So my last sort of interpretation of this term Co-videre, of seeing things together, is how can we, through how we now look, through what has been revealed to us, through how we now show up, how can we see things back together again? Almost a little bit like Humpty Dumpty, who had to be put back together again. How can we reweave and reconnect the world? Because the origins of the disconnection and the fragmentation and the individualism and the origins of what has brought us to the brink of this ecological collapse that we are facing has got very much to do with a kind of a reductionism that came to us through the sort of industrial revolution with, dare I say, capitalism, colonialism. So there is a direct link to what often is referred to as the kind of Newtonian era, where the world, this living conscious organism of the world, was considered almost as a machine, and where it almost seemed possible to deal with parts and components of things instead of seeing it in its integrous whole. We know that indigenous communities saw the earth as a whole living organism. And we know that knowledge is the knowledge that we lost over the last couple of 100 years. And we know that for us to survive as a species and for us to imagine a just world, part of what we need to do is to reintegrate that which got separated and disconnected under the last couple of 100 years.
And Ilse, I feel it so much. I think going through the pandemic and having the time, but also having the conversations with people, I think it brought about new conversation. But we were so much more, we were becoming so much more inward about me and I, and really, I think for me, listening to you and hearing you saying this again, is that certainly for myself, the consciousness around, you are because I am, that Ubuntu type of thing has really, if I don't wear my mask as an example, and whether we all agree with masks or not, but these were things that we had to start doing in society. Or if one has symptoms, it's irresponsible to go out into the community, or, as we were talking today, you have to work out those. And I think everyone has started thinking more about the other. And what I really am interested to know, because for me, the one thing I hope around the pandemic is that as a species, we really learn something. When people talk about the normal, I think I always say to them, please don't use that word, because I don't want to go back. Can we not talk about, and I think it's a word you use, the new unusual.
That's right. Yeah.
And let's not go back to the normal, because actually we have to have learned. We have to rise out of this with learning. So I'm interested to know how you think as individuals, as part of this organism, is what can each one of us do to move towards this oneness?
Okay, so before we get to the doing part.
Am I jumping the gun as usual?
I think before we get to the doing part, I want to pause a little bit and to share what emerged for me out of this hot mess that I was talking about earlier, this hot mess of contradicting emotions. And I resisted the impulse to go into action. I resisted the impulse to kind of, rush out and join our local cans and get involved in the community, or to, declutter the house, or to learn a new skill, or, all those stories of how people considered using their lockdown time. I felt a need to get quite quiet and quite reflective. And from this process, 6 aspects or dimensions, I've been struggling to find a word to how to name it, but 6 things, 6 words, 6 concepts emerged for me. And I've been working with these 6 concepts now for the last sort of almost 18 months. And those were also the ones that I shared with you. And they have been it's been very, very helpful for me. It has really kind of grounded me during this time. And it has, I felt as though it met the shape of the complexity that we were in. and of what was being kind of asked of me in a way. And so I want to share these six impulses, or these 6 moves, I think we call them. But before I do that, I just want to say 1 or 2 things about these 6 concepts, because it's important, I think, not to think of them as sort of linear steps, like you go through these linear steps, or that they are different stages of something. There is a logic to these 6 concepts. There is a particular logic how they follow the one on from the other. But to me, they represent more a kind of almost a kaleidoscope, or a set of fractals that one builds on the other. And I love the image that Josh chose for the banner for this talk, that beautiful sunflower with that inside of the sunflower that is kind of fractal-like. It also actually represents the world, but it also in a way can represent the iris of the eye, the iris of the eye, the all-seeing eye. And so I want to invite our participants to not to think of these 6 as a kind of a linear progression, but more as a kind of a kaleidoscope. And once I had internalized these 6 responses, they turned into a bit of a dance for me. Then I felt, okay, I need some containment. Then I felt, no, I need some wise counsel, or I want to offer counsel. Then it went to, oh, wait, now this has got to do with a bit of co-emergence. And so it was kind of dancing with these 6 dimensions. And that is really what it's been very dynamic and very alive for me in that sense. And what has also been very interesting for me is that this binary between spiritual work, meditating, intentioning, prayer, and action in the world, that binary seems to have gotten less and less and less for me over the last 18 months. And that for me is a very profound thing. It feels to me now that when I sit in prayer and I send and I honor a certain positive action that's happening in the world, and I want to work with the theme of consolidation, strengthening and consolidating what is a good positive action in the world, like, for example, Moyo Talks and the Moyo platform and the work that you do, then that to me feels like a very profound action in the world. When I sit and I focus my intention on something like the Moyo Talks initiative, and I send it prayers, and I intention for it to consolidate and to grow stronger and to reach even more people. To me, that has begun to feel like an action in the world. And so that's been quite a profound sort of thing for me. So the logic, is it good if I just go into the logic? The logic of these 6 components. So it starts with self. So that is where we start. We start with self, but the self is only number 1. There are 5 other significant dimensions that we move on to after connecting into self. And I think that's one of the things that has made me so uncomfortable with the New Age movement and with, a lot of sort of spiritual traditions, because it seems to me that very often things stop with the self. It starts and stops with the self. And we know that we need a healthy sense of self, an individuated sense of self in the world. But we also know, as you've already shared with us, that I am only who I am because of who you are, and that we are interdependent. And to even use Thich Nhat Hanh's beautiful concept. We interbe. We are interbeings. And so we have to move from the self to the other. And then once we've moved to the other, then we have to move into the world, into work in the world. What gives rise to our work in the world are the decisions that we make, our choice points. And what determines the choices that we make, the decisions that we make, is our worldview. And what serves our worldview is our kind of core purpose, our core dream, our core hope. And so these 6 elements cover those 6 dimensions. It covers our what in complexity language would be called the strange attractor, the kind of purpose, the goal, the purpose, the hope, the dream. It covers, it speaks to our worldview. It speaks to the idea of wise decisions. It speaks to the idea of consolidating work in the world. It speaks to our relationship to the suffering of others, and it speaks to our containment of our own being. And so those are then the six dimensions that I've worked with. And they, I think, as you mentioned in your introduction, they are all C words. And I like now, this is actually the first time that I've noticed, literally now, while we're talking, that C words could also be thought of as SEE, C words.
Absolutely.
given our theme of seeing and seeing together.
Yes.
But in fact, the words are more than just C words, as in the letter C, because they're actually CO words. They actually all start with co. And so that links obviously to the concept of Co-videre, of seeing together, and it links to this concept of being in community. It links to the concept of what we're going through is a collective process, that the time for individualism is over. And we need to distinguish obviously between individuating, which is finding your own destiny, dealing with your own path, your own shadow, doing your own work. We need to distinguish between that and a sense of individualism, because that is a ghost from the past. This idea that we are out there on our own and that we can survive or thrive on our own. So each of the words start with a co to evoke this idea of a collective journey that we're on, and also to try and evoke for us and remind us that we are essentially one living organism, one miraculous mind-bending organism called Gaia, which is, you know, a planetary system. And literally from the microbiome in my gut all the way to, you know, all the way to the planet itself, we are a living organism, all of us together. This seamless garment that many philosophers and I think Martin Luther King, and Makati will laugh at this point because white people love quoting Martin Luther King. But I think other people have also made this reference of this seamless garment that we all are together. So that is why it's kind of meaningful for me that all of these words start with co. Any questions from you at this point, or shall we dive into our 6 words, our 6 concepts?
I think for me, what I love hearing over and over again is this concept of oneness. And I think the more people understand and get this idea and this concept, because this is not a concept we were taught at school.
No.
You know, we were taught individual, you know, we were taught in capitalist ways. You know, we live in a capitalist country, we live in a capitalist world mostly. And the we and the co it wasn't part of our conversation. So again, it's a bit like we having to strip down the old paradigm, and even, you know, you talking about, for me in the world today, our parents came from the war, and they you know, the generations before us were a doing generation.
Yeah.
The children of today, you know, your kids and whatever, are not, they are more the contemplative. You know, the survival. We have houses, you know, not all of us, but generally there is actually enough for all of us to survive the basic needs. And if we're not doing that in our countries or in the world, it's showing that we are creating that.
Exactly.
Whereas we have been brought up to make sure that we provide a house and a this and a that. So this concept of oneness took me a long time as a spiritual person to understand, although I understood bits and pieces. Actually putting that together, that concept, took a lot. And still times I default out of it, because it wasn't what we were conditioned in the capitalist world to understand. And that breaking away from tribal, from community, we certainly, as growing up as I did, that wasn't part of it. It was all about
not at all
us. And so for me, I struggle when the neighbor comes with eggs today and an avo. I feel awkward. And he's just been a nice guy, I promise you. Charlie from over there brought me an avo. And it's kind of like, now what do I need to do? What is the expectation? He's got eggs and avo on his farm. He's just being kind. He's just being as a sense of community. I'm not used to that. So my default is different.
It is a very profound unlearning. It is a very profound unlearning, because not only is it something that, you know, we were completely conditioned into, but it's also still the master narrative all around us on every level. There's often the statement, do you think or are you thought? You know, and we are thought into a sense of separateness and a disconnection, and we literally do not have the perceptive abilities to be able to perceive, to be able to see the world together, to be able to see the interconnections. The term that I've been introduced to over the last while is this idea of transcontextuality, which is quite a mouthful. And it's the work of Nora Bateson, and I've become very intrigued with the Batesonian kind of legacy of thinking. There were 3 generations of systems thinker. William Bateson was the original one, and then Gregory is the father of Nora, and Nora Bateson is now running the Bateson Institute. And it is this realization that nothing is only that one thing and nothing more. So this beautiful protea right here is not just biology. It is also aesthetics. It is also employment for somebody. It is agriculture. It is poetry. It is a trans-contextual phenomenon. Every single aspect of our lives consist in this intersteeped kind of interwoven, entangled is the complexity term that gets used. Our lives are entangled in various contexts. And it is our biggest challenge. I think it is our biggest challenge for our co-emergence, which is our last co-word, our emerging together into a more just and thriving world, a world that can regenerate, is to be able to see things back together, to see them in their trans-contextual reality, and to be able to become, to be able to perceive the complex systems that we form part of, and to be able to become fluent in how one operates amidst complexity, and to let the Newtonian mechanistic industrial conveyor belt kind of approaches, to let them do the work that they need to do. Because if somebody's going to build a bridge, you don't want them to build it on intuition. You don't want them to channel. You don't want them to channel the architecture of the bridge.
No, we don't want that. Sorry, it's a very good example.
You want the engineers to follow a very structured and rigid protocols around safety and all the rest of it. So we're not wanting to chuck out all forms of mechanistic and sort of reductionist thinking and analytical thinking, but we have to, those of us who feel called to do it, have to now see the world back together again as a living system. So that starts us sort of at the end of our 6 moves. Is it starts us with this question of what is the just and thriving and regenerating world that we dream of? How are we imagining, how are we seeding and imagining and invoking that new world? That is the co-emergence aspect of this little mini process that I developed for myself. If we move back to sort of starting with the self, I realized the first thing I needed to do was to contain my own emotions, my own anxieties, my own fears, as they were sort of spilling out. And I realized that that's where my work started. And so as I meditated on that, what did I need to do to have a greater sense of containment? That's the co-word there, containment of self. And I realized that some of the work that I needed to do for myself was death work, was grief work, was shadow work. And it's been an incredible journey checking in all the time with what needs containing within myself. Where is the work that I need to do within myself? And as I've intentioned for that, the universe has brought me such beautiful stories. I just attended actually my aunt's funeral in the Eastern Cape. And my uncle just told me the story that I've always wanted to hear about my great-grandmother in the Boer concentration camps, and revealed to me the degree of intergenerational trauma that I always knew it sat in my family. And so my question to each of the participants tonight would be, if we start with this idea of containing and the idea of self, what do you need to tend to for yourself? What needs containing within yourself? And what is the work that you need to do for yourself at this time? But then, as I mentioned, that is not where we stop. That is just where we kind of start and where we check back into regularly. And I do this multiple times a day. When I feel triggered, when I feel anxiety rising up, was that a COVID exposure, or where's my next client coming from? Is there going to be money at the end of the month? You know, any fear that arises, I remind myself, what do I need in this moment? How do I regulate my nervous system in this moment? But then we move from there and we move to the other. And the question that came up for me, the word that came for me around the other, is this beautiful word, consolation. What needs to be consoled? How can the other be consoled? And so when I was so overwhelmed by the suffering of others during those first couple of months of lockdown, and continue to be now, as friends lose family members, as many friends have lost livelihoods, as people are struggling on so many levels, this epidemic of mental health issues, the incredible economic distress that so many people are in, we can carry on enumerating the different ways in which people that we care for and love are suffering, and even people that we do not know at all, but people right here, not far from where we're sitting, there is an informal settlement where who knows how people have endured these last 2-3 weeks of icy weather. We look at the beautiful snow on the mountains, and there are people in sodden shacks, with maybe no food, no electricity. What do we do in that moment? We can be overwhelmed by it, which is not helpful to anybody. Or we can go into a practice of sending prayers and blessings and asking for consolation. And the origin of the word consolation, actually also again from the Latin, has to do with encouragement. It has to do with comfort, comforting people, but it also has to do with encouraging people, which has got to do with strengthening also the heart forces. And so now, whenever I see a situation that is beyond my control and I can feel the emotion rising in me, and I think about Kuan Yin, the Buddhist female embodiment of the Buddha, in her bodhisattva form, who listens to the suffering of the world with compassion. That is her task, to bear witness, to listen to the suffering of the world with compassion, and to console and to encourage. And it's been very helpful for me, instead of just to be overwhelmed by other people's suffering, is to, in that moment, intention and direct a prayer for consolation and for encouragement. Sometimes you can act on that. I'm not saying don't act. If there is something that you can do in a practical, physical, economic, monetary, whatever way, if you feel called to that, if an opportunity presents itself, please do that, act on that. But we don't only have to act physically in the face of so much overwhelming suffering. We can also send into the world a healing energy of consolation where there is grief, where there is suffering, where there is deprivation. And then that moves us on to this idea of consolidating, strengthening and consolidating what is good in the world, the good work that is happening in the world. And so I can also ask our participants again, just to reflect, this incredible sort of open-hearted feeling that we get when we think about the frontline workers, the first responders, when we think about teachers that have continued to teach, throughout this time, the people that still, collect our waste, the people that are doing research to respond to the issues that we're facing, the climate activists. Wherever we see an impulse in the world that is acting with that intention of doing good in the world, and what in a way inspired this idea of consolidating and strengthening what is good in the world was the whole CAN system, the community networks that sprung up in Greater Cape Town, and I think in other parts of the country as well during that lockdown period. And this incredible phenomenon of people reaching out across the apartheid divide, across this apartheid spatial planning of our city. And there are such inspiring and beautiful stories. And at this point, I don't want to talk only about charity, because there is also, there's an element of justice involved, not just an element of charity. And in the CANs that have worked really well, something very profound has happened, where it is not just handouts from the rich to the less advantaged, but where real relationships are being forged. So I invite our participants to think about where do they encounter the organizations or individuals or institutions or initiatives that are doing good in the world. And whilst we can't all support them financially or physically join them, we can pray an intention for a strengthening and a consolidating of those initiatives in the world that are doing good. And then that leads me to the next co, which is the incredibly challenging time that we find ourselves in, where at both a micro, a very mini, but also at a macro, at a very large level, decisions have to be made that have such incredible impact. And so this was inspired with the lockdown, where governments all over the world had to make decisions between this binary between lives and livelihoods. Lockdowns that saved lives, but that compromised economies and livelihoods. And how do you make those decisions where you don't have enough data? It is in such a context of uncertainty. How do you make your best decision? And that's at a macro level. Now we can extrapolate that to this IPCC report, the latest one that came out just 2 weeks ago, and the need now for really very profound action that will ask of us to imagine a zero carbon world. It's almost beyond our imaginations, and decisions have to be made about that. For each of us at a micro level, decisions have to be made. Are we going out? Are we going to socially distance? Are we going to change our lives? Are we going to leave an abusive relationship? Are we going to how are we going to deal with a toxic situation at work, or whatever it might be? So these times have thrown up so many decisions that have to be made. And mostly we make decisions not with all the data in hand. And so the next co-word is this idea of counsel, of wise counsel. And so again, we can pray and intention and send energetically wise counsel to people who have to make really difficult decisions. And we can ask for ourselves for wise counsel every time we have to make a decision, how small it might be. We can ask for that wise counsel. And then moving on from the decision making. So we've got the containment of the self, we've got consolation for the other, we've got consolidation for what's good in the world, we've got counsel, wise counsel for the decisions that we need to make. Moving on, we wish for ourselves the ability to really unlearn this sense of separateness that we were talking about earlier, and to really be able to perceive the complexity of the world that we live in. And it's this term complexity that's the next co-word. So often the term complexity is misunderstood as just something very complicated, but that is not what it is. A complex system is a living, adaptive system, an interdependent living system with vitality, aliveness in it, and with profound relationships and entanglements amongst the different elements that make up that system. And we have to become far more fluent in understanding complexity. So, for example, a garden is a complex adaptive system. And so if you're a gardener, you'll know that you can't just take one element of the garden without thinking how that will impact on the whole ecosystem, the whole ecology of the garden. And every aspect of the garden impacts every other aspect of the garden. So it is not just one plant to the power of another, but it is every plant and every insect and every microbe in the soil, and it is the sun and the rain and the shade and the wind and the tender loving care and the pruning and the weeding and the quality of the seed. It is every single aspect, all to the power of each other, that makes up this complex adaptive system. And we need to learn how to be with our society and with our world as a complex adaptive system. And then the final one is the one that we started off with, where we have to, as you said, we cannot go back to normal. Normal is what brought us here. That is trite. That's become a cliche. People have been saying that. But where then do we go? We need to co-emerge. We need collectively to, you again mentioned it, Cindy, learn, and then emerge together in a different way. We have to reimagine our economic systems. There's all this talk around a basic income grant. That would be a good initiative in the world that would require consolidating and strengthening. But we have to go beyond just the basic income grant, where we have to really reimagine a new economic system. We have to reimagine our health systems. We can't carry on working with these medical models, these pathology-orientated models that's not focusing on us strengthening our immune systems, strengthening wellness, working with a range of modalities that we know, that you know, as the Moyo hosts, support wellness and support health. We have to reimagine our education system. Our education system was conceived and is designed to fit a reductionist model, an industrial model. So there is a new world that has to be dreamt into being. And it is quite urgent that we do that. And we need inspiration. We literally need inspiration. And inspiration, again, the origin of the word is breath. Spire is breath, and inspiration is breath. It's kind of a holy breath that we need to take to inspire us to be able to imagine a new world so that we can co-emerge together into a more just and thriving world. And those are my 6 co-words. And those are the words that I dance with now every day, and that have really helped me to move with what these times
Mm.
have asked of me, and I think of us.
Yeah. I would love to pick into each of the co-words, but I think the one that I'd really like to pick up on is this dreaming, because as being an intuitive myself, what's quite interesting is information coming through for me is very much around concepts that feel quite uncomfortable in terms of how do we cohabitate in a different way? How do we, fulfill each other's needs? And that is already changing as much as, even the thoughts and the dreaming. And I think that, collectively, if there is a collective consciousness around the change rather than a resistance. And I think that's what I love about these. It's about creating the change. It's giving the tools to support our species in change. And that's what it's done for me. And that's what I'm feeling when I'm going through these and I'm thinking about my own challenges and how I look at these is like, well, how do we change? How do we transform? And it's not linear. This is not a linear, we start here and we learn this, and then, we take this food out of our diet to lose these kilos. It's not what we used to, the world that we're in now, that linear, two-dimensional, three-dimensional, it's bigger than what we used to. But what's also interesting for me, it's going back to some of the ancient wisdom, and what we've learned from elements in our species. And I don't know if we haven't got much time, but I'd really love you to talk about some of the ancient methodology around how this concept of this new way of thinking might, how it might support, because we can invoke that knowledge again.
Yes. So as you say, we don't have a lot of time. So I think all I'm going to say is that one of the indigenous scholars, a decolonial and indigenous scholars that I follow is a scholar from Hawaii, Manulani Maya is her name. And she talks about the new old ways,
Right.
And to me, that is a perfect way of summarizing what we need to be doing, because there is old knowledges and old, sometimes ancient, sometimes even mythological support for what we're needing to reconnect with now. But then we also mustn't romanticize too much the past, and we must also bring our latest scientific and other thinking into the conversation so that we can work with this new old ways. But I think what I'd like to leave in the evening off with, I do have a beautiful quote that I'd like to share, but what I'd like to end the evening off with is with our theme of seeing, of co-videre, seeing together, and the I, and then this idea of the iris. And I was very intrigued by this idea of the iris. And then I remembered that Iris is in fact a goddess, a Greek goddess. And so I went to have a look a little bit at Iris. And I now am calling on Iris quite a lot, on the goddess energy of Iris. She's actually the rainbow goddess, the goddess of the rainbow. And she is considered to be the messenger between the gods and humanity. And she moves with the wind. And she's also the one who replenishes the clouds with her pitcher. She takes water from the oceans and replenishes the clouds. And all of this imagery, the image of the rainbow, not that we want to reinforce this idea of the rainbow nation, but we do want to work with what is good about that concept, not the ways in which we have used it not to face the legacies of the past, but what is good about the rainbow, the promise of the rainbow, the promise of transcendence and of overcoming suffering, and also the way in which it connects heaven and earth, and the ecological images that are there. So Goddess Iris, for me, feels like she's very real and very close during this time.
Mm-hmm.
But that is from the Greeks. And if we want to come back to Africa and to our continent, then within the ancient Egyptian system, there is also the Eye of Ra, the Eye of Ra. And the Eye of Ra was considered a female deity in the Egyptian system. And she was also, she was life-giving, but she was also a fierce protector of life, fierce, like a lioness. And so we also want to call on the Eye of Ra, that fierceness in protecting what is valuable and what is, and our planet and our collective sense of humanity and dignity. So to me, that was quite a beautiful way in which the mythologies have kind of come into this particular kind of this particular dance that I've been dancing with, this idea of seeing anew, seeing together. Yeah. So shall we kind of come to the end of our time? We're a few minutes over.
Which is fine. I'm just wondering if anybody has any questions about these moves and these concepts of weaving and looking at how maybe just to shift our thinking just a little bit, just to, you know, how do we look at things differently? How do we dream in a conscious way, in a movement way, to support where we are right now? So I think, Ilse, thank you so much for sharing that wonderful knowledge with the platform. And as I say, there don't seem to be any questions.
Yeah, I'm hoping that there will be food for thought, as we say, and that something from our conversation might have struck a chord with somebody. I want to say from my side, thank you so much to you, Cindy, for these incredibly generative and rich conversations that we have had over these last months, and the work that you and Josh behind the scenes and others do in the world, and this platform that you have created for this inquiry and doing the spiritual work of this time. Shall I share my quote, my final quote?
Absolutely.
So it's a quote by Joanna Macy, and I'm sure many of the participants will know that Joanna Macy is a real elder in the kind of climate movement. She's also a Buddhist and a systems thinker. And I want to say thank you to Christine Nachman, my friend Christine Nachman, for sharing this quote on our Zen group, our Zoom Zen group. So I thought it was quite appropriate. And she says, uncertainty, and that was a word that came up a lot, I think, this evening, and it has been in our conversations. Uncertainty, when accepted, sheds a bright light on the power of intention. This is what you can count on. Not the outcome, but the motivation you bring, the vision you hold, the compass setting you choose to follow. So uncertainty, when accepted, sheds a very bright light on the power of intention. This is what we can count on, she says, not the outcome. The outcome is not up to us, not the outcome, but the motivation we bring, the intention, the motivation, where we put our intention, where we send our prayers, what we tend to, the motivation we bring, the vision we hold, and the compass setting we choose to follow.
Ilse, thank you so much for a wonderful masterclass, a wonderful conversation, enlightening, food for thought. I think it's landing with everybody. And I just appreciate so much what you give to me personally, as a friend, as a colleague, I would say, and what you have brought to our platform over the last months. Thank you so much. We really appreciate, the work and the effort you put into the work that you share with us. So thank you very much for that.